press green and see what thing goes on. Yep. Hello? Whoa. That's good sound. Hello, welcome everybody. Can you all hear me? Yes, hello. I'm Mary Fitzgerald. I'm the editor-in-chief of openDemocracy. We're a global media organisation headquartered in London, but with people and stories all over the world. Thank you all for coming. We've been hearing a lot at this journalism festival about business models for journalism and technology for journalism and future models, fancy high-tech stuff. We're going to talk about old-fashioned shoe leather journalism mostly in this panel. We've got an excellent gathering of people here who've all done really important and impressive stories recently, and we want to hear about exactly how they've put those stories together. We'll start with Peter Geoghegan, who's the investigations editor at openDemocracy, and we'll start with the particular national trauma or psychosis that's going on in Britain right now called Brexit. And he can talk a little bit about some of the work we've done around that.
Yes, I could hear the collective groan in the room when the word Brexit came. I think we all feel a little bit like that. And I'm just going to talk very quickly about some of the work we've been doing at openDemocracy. And I'll just begin by saying a lot of this work started about 2 years ago. And if you told me 2 years ago that we'd still be doing this work 2 years later about Brexit and money and finance and who paid for politics in Britain, I would have been really surprised, but yeah, I'm still here and still doing it. So basically, a lot of the work that we've been doing, what we call this kind of dark money series, and what really we mean by that, like dark money is just money from unaccountable sources that comes into the political system. And the word really comes originally from America, and we're seeing it more and more in Europe. I think we'll talk about that in this session, but what I'm going to talk about is what specifically we saw happening in Britain during the Brexit referendum. And I became kind of interested in this when I was covering the Brexit referendum, and I noticed that there was, I was in Sunderland, which is a small town in Northern England, and I got on the suburban rail train about 3 days before the Brexit referendum, and I picked up this free newspaper called the Metro, and there's a huge big advert in the Metro. It said, "Vote Leave, take back control," which is the message of the Vote Leave campaign. And on the back, they had the logo of a political party called the Democratic Unionist Party, the DUP, who at the time most people wouldn't have heard of in the UK, actually. But I used to work in Northern Ireland, so I knew them quite well. And I was really surprised that this political party for Northern Ireland was spending this huge big advert in Sunderland. And I kind of thought nothing of it and continued reporting. And then about 6 months later, my colleague at openDemocracy, Adam Ramsey, came to me and started asking, "Are you interested in the DUP? Because I've been looking at their funding for the Brexit campaign." And so I'm really interested in that. So we started doing some more digging, and we published a story about how the DUP had spent over £250,000 on Brexit, which is the biggest political spending in the history of Northern Ireland. So we kept on going with that story, and we eventually found out that they spent almost £450,000, all of it in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, not in Scotland, not in Northern Ireland. And basically, they were able to do this because they were able to do this without declaring where the funding came from, because there was a loophole in Northern Irish law, which meant the political donations were secret. So that was going back to the Troubles, the conflict in Northern Ireland. So at that stage, we were able to find out as well that the man who's behind this donation, well, who channeled donation to the DUP, he wasn't the guy who funded it, was a man called Richard Cook, who was a former Conservative Party candidate in Glasgow, actually coincidentally where I live. And subsequently discovered that Richard Cook had gone into business with the former head of Saudi intelligence, a man who'd been involved in gun running, a Danish man who'd been involved in gun running in India. Richard Cook had also been involved in selling international waste around the world. He'd bought $80 million worth of railway tracks from a convicted fraudster, railway tracks that didn't exist. Basically, this was a man of seriously questionable background. And so we published a lot of stories about this. Nothing happened, though. The Electoral Commission in Britain decided not to investigate it, but laws did change in Northern Ireland. But this got me thinking, well, what about the rest of the money that was spent during the Brexit vote? Because it's a big, big referendum in Britain, and Britain doesn't have a history of referendums. I'm Irish, as you might tell from my accent. We have a lot of referendums in Ireland. We have kind of a bit of a reasonably sophisticated way of going about them. But in Britain, a referendum's a completely new event. So I was going, well, what other money was spent? So I started looking at other things. I looked at how the main official Leave campaign had spent their money, and I discovered that they'd given £625,000 to a 16-year-old, 23-year-old fashion student about a week before the referendum. And not only had they given him this money, they'd actually spent it on his behalf with a data analyst company based in Canada called Aggregate IQ. And again, I was like, well, what's going on here? How is this possible? This guy had set up this campaign. His name was Darren Grimes. He set up a campaign called Believe. In about 6 months, he'd raised £107,000, £107, and in the last week, he spent 675 grand. So I started digging into that and asking what had happened. I sent a lot of freedom of information requests to the Electoral Commission. And basically, the Electoral Commission decided not to investigate, but they subsequently reopened their investigation, and he's been fined and has been reported to the Metropolitan Police. Surprisingly, we also reported that the Metropolitan Police have still yet to actually get the documentation from the Electoral Commission, never mind begin their investigation. But that started me looking a bit more. We did a lot of work on a man called Aaron Banks, who some of you might be familiar with. And Aaron Banks was the biggest spender during the Brexit referendum. Aaron Banks was a kind of an insurance, he described himself as an insurance businessman. He said he did big in insurance, and he owned gold mines in southern Africa. And Aaron Banks spent over £10 million during the Brexit vote, which was the biggest spend in the history of British politics. And what was surprising about Aaron Banks in many ways was that if you looked into his company accounts, as we started to do, you fairly quickly thought, well, this is a guy who doesn't really seem to have that much money. How do you afford to do this? And we started doing that maybe kind of towards the end of 2017, so over a year after the Brexit vote. And there hadn't been that much coverage of this man in British press, to be honest. A lot of people had just accepted that this was a guy who was what he said he was, a businessman, and he wanted this thing to happen, wanted Brexit to happen. So we started I started doing a lot of digging into him and his businesses and his companies and his political operation as well. As well as that, we also I started looking into his gold mines, and he had a gold mine in a place called Lesotho, which is a small state in southern Africa. And he said he'd got this gold mine there, and he'd found this huge big stone, and he was going to use it to fund a new political party with a man called Nigel Farage, who you might be familiar with. He was going to start a new political party with Nigel Farage, and this huge big emerald that he'd found was going to fund it. But it turned out subsequently, as I started to do some digging, that and I'd been to Lesotho, so I was surprised by this, because it's a small, very poor mountainous country. And I'm not a diamond expert, but normally diamonds come at the mouth of rivers, not at their source, which is the Orange River source is in Lesotho. So basically, long and short of it was, this diamond mine basically barely existed. The world's expert in Lesotho diamonds said it was geologically impossible to find this diamond. And Mr. Banks was actually funding one of the local political parties, having said he was working for them and doing consultancy, he was actually paying into their bank account. So we started doing a lot more work on that, and finally a lot of journalists in the UK did start to become interested in Aaron Banks. And we've seen through the course of the work we've been doing, there's been a series of fines have been levied against a lot of the Brexit campaigners by the Electoral Commission, which is the elections regulator. There's Information Commissioner's Office has fined Aaron Banks, it's fined Vote Leave as well, because Vote Leave spent over £3 million with this obscure Canadian company called Aggregate IQ in the last couple of weeks of the referendum, sending targeted Facebook ads. And we'll hear more about targeted ads later in this talk. But the ICO was fined them for that. The National Crime Agency, which is the kind of biggest police force in Britain, is investigating Aaron Banks. But what's interesting as well is that in some ways nothing really has happened. You know, the Electoral Commission's the biggest fine they can give is £20,000. So it's very, very little money. It's not exactly dissuading people from doing things. So you know, these groups are overspending by huge amounts of money, and the maximum fine is £7,000. Britain still has exact same laws it had during the referendum, so it's still really possible, and we're still seeing this kind of dark money flowing into British politics. We're still seeing people spending in ways that we don't know where it comes from. We don't know where this finance comes from. And what we've also seen is that groups are able to use kind of opaque ways of funding. So we did a lot of work over the last 2 years on a group called the European Research Group, who some of you might have heard of. And we started looking at the European Research Group. They weren't really very well known, I think. They were a small group of hardline conservatives. And now my mother knows who the European Research Group is. So it kind of gives a sense that these guys have gone from not very important to like being they're kind of very important in the Conservative Party. And again, what we saw with the European Research Group is they were taxpayer funded. They were able to get money from taxpayers, but also were really, really opaque about where their money was coming from. They had second bank accounts, but because they were a group that existed within Parliament of parliamentarians, it wasn't clear who was regulating them. It still isn't. So they're basically unregulated. They've a series of different regulators involved with the regulation of it. So across all the work that we've been doing over the last 2 years, it's been kind of really interesting to see just how much money is starting to influence politics, but also how easy it is and how opaque the system is.
Thank you, Peter. I think the Brexit story is tragic and convoluted and is going to carry on and on and on. But I think the question is not just who financed the campaign to leave the European Union, which is important for us to know, but how the system works, how money is able to flow, money from undeclared or undisclosed sources is able to flow into national politics and into referendum and into elections, but more broadly into public conversation. And I wanted to introduce Alice Ross from Greenpeace here, because you've done quite a lot of work looking at organisations that have outsized influence on policymakers and on public conversations. So tell me a bit more about that.
Yep, so I work for Greenpeace Unearthed, which is an investigative unit inside Greenpeace UK, and we partner with mainstream media organisations to produce environmental investigations. And we spent about half of last year on an undercover investigation looking at the different ways that think tanks, which do not disclose their funders, could influence political processes inside the UK. Now, and particularly around Brexit. Now, why is Brexit an environmental issue? Why is it something that Greenpeace is looking at? Well, Brexit is the source, the EU is the source of most of our environmental laws. And what we found was that there were large numbers of UK think tanks, many of which had links to US think tanks, which are funded by organisations like the Koch brothers and other sort of right-wing causes. They were pushing for a US-UK free trade deal, which could lead to the UK being forced to accept products such as chlorine-washed chicken, hormone-reared beef, chemicals that are currently banned under EU-level environmental protections. So it's Brexit is an important story for us. So, as I say, we became aware that a number of US and UK think tanks, which don't declare their funders and are quite conservative in their leanings, were working to model out a US-UK free trade deal and to really work with politicians to push for such a free trade deal. So we went undercover. We posed as representatives of investors in US hormone-reared beef, and we basically tried to buy our way into the process. What we found was that a think tank called the Institute of Economic Affairs, which is a really respected think tank in the United Kingdom, they are quoted on their representatives appear on broadcast news. They're quoted very respectfully in the media. Their reports gain a lot of attention, but they don't disclose their donors. What we found, and they've also acquired a really significant role in the Brexit talks, particularly recently, particularly in the past 18 months, after they hired a trade lawyer called Shankar Singham, who is he's like the favourite trade expert of the European Research Group, which is this very influential group of right-wing Brexiteer politicians who Peter was just referring to. Now, Shankar Singham is their favoured trade lawyer. He writes their trade process. He writes their trade policy. He's held up as their prime guru. So the question was, obviously, who funds them? We didn't find out really who funds them, but what we did find out was that in our guise as, US hormone beef investors, we could get into the room with them. We found that they boasted about how they'd taken US donors who had offered to fundraise for them into meetings of the European Research Group. They'd hosted meetings by cabinet ministers, by ministers, junior ministers, at their offices for these beef donors. They'd connected their funders who had a vested interest in a deregulatory Brexit, and they'd taken these donors and they'd connected them with senior politicians. So effectively, they were offering access to senior politicians for vested interests, and we would never have known this if we hadn't taken the step of going undercover. They offered us the opportunity to fund a report into farming after Brexit for £42,500. They were very clear that we wouldn't be able to influence the conclusions of that report, but we could definitely make sure that our interests were represented, and we could influence the content and the salience of that report. And they also said that they would try very hard to get Michael Gove a dinner between our donor and Michael Gove, where we could raise our issues and make sure that our issues were represented. So effectively what we found was that they were offering access to senior politicians at the heart of this major political process in exchange for donations. And it really illustrated how really respected and prominent organisations who don't declare their donors can be used as a conduit for access to really senior politicians at the centre of Brexit. So what happened after we published? Well, Shankar Singham recently wrote a major part of he wrote an instrument called the Malthouse Compromise, which at one point was going to be the Brexiteers' plan, so he remains extremely influential. But the IEA is a charity, is an educational charity, and they've been slammed by the Charity Commissioner for basically stepping outside of their charitable role in order to lobby for a particular political cause. Yeah, so that's what we did. That's how we set out to expose them.
Thank you, Alice. I mean, that was an interesting example. I think probably people in lots of different countries can relate to the idea that you have these institutions that are supposed to be full of experts and expertise, but who have very clear political agendas and a lot of access to platforms in the media and politicians to push those agendas.
Yeah, and for us, the key thing was that you can't tell who's funding them,
yeah,
where the money's coming from.
Yeah, the lack of transparency over the interests that they represent.
Yeah.
I'll come back to that point actually a bit later. But so think tanks and lobby groups is one way of influencing public opinion and policy. But targeting voters online is another increasingly popular and effective way of doing it. Sam Jeffers from Who Targets Me. Can you tell me a little bit about the work you've been doing both UK and abroad across Europe?
Sure. So Who Targets Me is effectively a crowdsourcing project to try and understand and reverse engineer, reverse engineer political advertising on Facebook. So basically we ask people to install a small piece of software in their browser that gives users some more context around the ads that they're being targeted with, so it kind of creates a personalized archive of the ads that you're seeing, but then also contributes those ads to a data set that can be used for wider research. So we started the project in 2017 for the general election in the UK, because post the Brexit referendum, obviously there was a lot of interest in how this material was being used to try and persuade people. Was it, how influential was it? And have since then run the project in a number of other countries, several other European countries, in the Irish abortion referendum last year, a number of other places. And, we have about 15,000 people taking part now, so who are kind of sharing this information with us. So an example of what's been going on there and how different groups are using Facebook to try and persuade people. Let's take the kind of Brexit story again, because although the Brexit referendum said that Britain would leave the EU, then the debate really began at that point. And so in the middle of 2018, we started to see this organisation called the Mainstream Network popping up in our advert data quite a lot. They had a website, but no contact information. Nothing they gave away online revealed who was behind it. And some kind of meta-analysis of those ads suggested that organisation would probably spend £250,000 trying to persuade people that a no-deal Brexit was the kind of legitimate result of the referendum. In about October, Facebook announced that it would start to bring about some new transparency tools, launch some new tools, at which point that Mainstream Network page stopped existing, disappeared, ran no more ads from that point onwards. And what popped up in its place was a page called Britain's Future, which is currently the largest spending political advertiser in the UK. They've spent nearly £500,000 on Facebook ads in the last 4 or 5 months, reaching millions of people. Predominantly, they ask people to email their MP and say that they support a no-deal Brexit. So it's what appears to look, or is trying to look like, a grassroots campaign to influence, have constituents influence their own MPs to support this particular outcome. There's also a number of similar organisations who spent less money but who are running different angles of the same story. So while Britain's Future is very interested on people taking action, there's another page called We Are the 52, which promotes kind of pro-Brexit stories about how the future will be great if we have a no-deal Brexit. Britain's Future, again, has no real contact information on its Facebook page or website. There is one individual associated with it, a guy called Tim Dawson, who's a youngish conservative activist, very much sort of fits the kind of Darren Grimes mould, doesn't have £500,000 of his own to spend on political campaigning. Has even failed to do some of the basic things that he does, given that he processes people's data, so he hasn't registered with the Data Protection Commission and people like that. And so, you get this situation where a political option, no deal, which wasn't really part of the referendum campaign at all and isn't an option that many MPs favour, is suddenly something that MPs are receiving tens of thousands of emails about, where in the polling that as an option has gone from, 0 to, depending on who you listen to, you know, for up to 40% of the British population now favours a no-deal Brexit. But at the same time, you know, we've no idea where the money is coming from to pay for that. It's quite a large source of, you know, quite a large sum of money, and you know, is being used in this quite, you know, disingenuous way. You know, it's what appears to be a grassroots organisation. And so what happened this week was the Guardian had a kind of a breakthrough on this story and reported on the fact that, in fact, these number of Facebook pages were being run by a company called Crosby, Textor and F, and I forget what the F stands for, CTF Partners, and that's run by a guy called Linton Crosby, who is an Australian strategist who has run the Conservative Party campaign for the last 3 general elections, has run Boris Johnson's campaigns for mayor, and is very kind of in with the British kind of conservative establishment. And so effectively you have this lobbying firm taking money from an unknown source, filtering it through Facebook ads in order to try and swing public opinion behind a no-deal Brexit in the service of who knows what. And so, you know, finally, you know, some of the transparency that we've been creating and some of the tools that Facebook has now been using, and the journalists who are now kind of going after that story and able to kind of get their arms around the size of it, are beginning to make some progress, you know, and we hope that, you know, this sort of activity begins to act as a deterrent on running these types of AstroTurf kind of fake, basically, campaigns. But I think the point of it is that you have to be, you know, on the lookout, and you have to be starting to use these different methods. So one of the things we're doing is launching across the EU for the European elections. We've just launched our software in all 27 EU countries. It's available for anyone who wants to use it. We're also looking for partners in any countries. If there's anyone here who is interested in reporting on this data or kind of learning how to report on this data, would be very welcome to have a conversation afterwards. Can you say a bit about how
people can do that?
So there's 2 things. So you can go to our website and you can install the software and you can just participate as an individual. And the second is you can just email us using the contact page on our website. And if you want to do some reporting, or you want to like have a think about how this data might be relevant where you are, I think that would be, you know, that's certainly a thing that we're looking to do a lot more of. You know, in the goal of looking for the interesting features of modern political influence and campaigning. You know, who is trying to reach who, where's the money they're getting, you know, where's the money they're spending coming from. You know, is that, you know, are we interested in what's happening on the European right, on the European left, what's happening through corporate interests? All of these sorts of things become stories that we hope that we can kind of tell through the medium of like the Facebook ads that people are using to try and create some influence.
Thank you, Sam. The question you asked, where's the money coming from, brings me very nicely on to Stefano. Tell me, what do you know about where political money is coming from in Italy? And you can shamelessly plug your book as well if you'd like to.
Well, I can tell you something about how money are being channeled to Lega from Russia, or at least what was the plan for channeling millions of euros to Lega from people very close to Vladimir Putin. This is one of the pieces of news that are contained in the book that I wrote along with my colleague Giovanni Tizian, and it's called Il Libro Nero della Lega, which means the Black Book of Lega. It's all about, it's a 2 years investigation on Lega and Salvini, covering different topics, but one of the main one is the funding of Lega. So we started from a very basic question, which is how Lega was sustaining itself, given the fact that its bank accounts were seized by an Italian prosecutor because of a scam that was done by Lega's founder, Umberto Bossi. So basically Lega, Salvini's Lega, didn't have money to sustain itself. So we started to investigate on how the party was getting money from different sources. For example, through association or foundation, which is another big issue because they're not forced to declare the sources of the money coming in, and then they can fund political parties or member of the parliament. Well, we ended up in Russia, in Moscow, last year, October 2018. On the 17th of October, Salvini was there for a public visit. After the press conference, Salvini disappeared for 12 hours, and we found out that he met privately with the Deputy Prime Minister of Russia, Dmitry Kozak. The day after, we were inside an hotel in Moscow, in the center of Moscow, the Metropole Hotel. Of course, we had sources within Lega helping us finding out this piece of news. But we went in Moscow to verify that the source was telling us the truth. And what we found out is that, so the day after this private meeting between Salvini and Kozak, the former Salvini spokesperson, Gianluca Savoini, was in this hotel negotiating with another 2 Italians and 3 Russians, one of them very close to Vladimir Putin. They were negotiating a big funding for Lega through a deal concerning diesel. So it's quite interesting to tell you the mechanic of the funding, because what the people were talking about at the Metropole Hotel was that a state-owned Russian company called Rosneft was going to sell 3 million tons of diesel to the Italian state-owned company Eni, with a European bank acting as a filter. The 3 million tons of diesel, which is a very big amount of diesel, and let's say more or less the value, it's worth $1.5 billion, was going to be sold to Eni with a 4% discount. At the end of the deal, it was not Eni benefiting of this discount, but was Lega. So this was the negotiation ongoing. We have hard evidences that the negotiation started at least in July 2018 until October 2018. We don't know whether the transaction was actually took place, but we know that negotiation was ongoing. And I think it's politically relevant to disclose this kind of news in terms of the reaction of the public and the media. Very shortly, I can just say that the piece of news was broadly covered overseas, but in Italy, basically no TVs are talking about that.
So I wanted to ask you about that, because so tell me, so what's the amount involved? 4% of 1.2 billion, right? So roughly, my maths is terrible.
50 million euros.
So 50 million euros. And what kind of influence does that buy in Italy? Like, what's the budget for a national election campaign, for example?
I think it's probably, I'm not sure about that, but it's probably less than 10 million euros for sure.
Okay, so it could have paid for around 5 election campaigns.
Yeah.
All right, and the law. So you mentioned that they use institutions which allow them to not have to declare who their donors are. So what's the law in Italy around political donations? Like, and what do political parties have to declare, and what's expected? Because, for example, in the UK, if you give more than 10,000 euros to a political party, your name goes on a public register. How does it work?
It's pretty much the same, with the difference that you have to declare any sum coming in above 5,000 euros.
Okay.
So we also work on other political parties on this issue. And what we found out that I think is pretty interesting and should be changed is what I was mentioning before. Very often political parties and members of the parliament, especially now that public funding is not possible anymore in Italy, they use foundations or associations as filters to get money. This way, they don't have to declare the source of the money, and it's all legal. Lega and the Five Star Movement, when they were the opposition, they kept on saying, we're going to change this. Now they've been in power for 1 year, and they're not talking about it anymore.
That sounds very familiar. This brings me on and reminds me of a story that we published on Open Democracy last week, which was a result of many months of investigative work, particularly looking at data and looking at filings from US-based organizations. So I think the connection between the Lega and Russia is well known. I mean, your work has brought to light really, really interesting and important questions. But Salvini's fairly open about his admiration for Russia, and it's a talking point for him, right? It's not something he's trying to hide. What I think is interesting about the story we put out last week was our colleague Claire Provo, who's based in Turin, had looked at the filings of a number of US Christian conservative groups based in the United States. These are lobbying organizations that campaign against abortion, against LGBTI rights, against sex education across the world. And a lot of their activities in Africa and Latin America are well known. Their support for laws criminalizing homosexuality and really harsh penalties for an abortion. This is the kind of hardcore right-wing groups in the United States. But it turns out that together 12 of these groups have pumped more than $50 million of campaign money into Europe over the last 10 years. And they're funding a lot of campaigns here, but quietly. And they're also building a number of connections with the far right across Europe. So they were all gathered with our friend Matteo Salvini in Verona last weekend at the World Congress of the Families. And there have been all kinds of questions raised, like, 40 MEPs signed a letter saying, this is astonishing and we need to know more about this and we need to take action. And while we know about the interference of states in European democracy, the action of well-funded predominantly American-based lobby groups in Europe is far less well known. So I'd encourage you all to go and have a look at that piece on Open Democracy by Claire Provo, because it really lifts the lid on the way that things can be done perfectly legally, as far as we can tell, to influence public conversation and influence agendas around certain topics and issues that also feed into the political agendas of Lega, Fidesz, these other far-right parties that are increasingly using these kind of family values narrative as part of their campaigning platform. And indeed, it's interesting that many of these parties across Europe present themselves as grassroots and, native and local, when in fact they're connected up to these international organizations that are resourcing them and helping them further their objectives in ways that we really don't understand well yet. So there's going to be more of that coming on Open Democracy in the coming months. I wanted to open this up to questions now. We can continue talking between us, and I've got lots of questions I'd like to ask panel members in follow-up. But if anyone has questions they want to ask, please put your hand up and we can take a few of those. So we have 1, 2, 3 over there. Do you want to just, we can probably hear you, so if you just stand up and say who you are and ask a question, we'll take all 3 of you and we'll come back to the panel after that.
Hi, my name is Paul May. I work for a company called WebEx-Ray. And I'm trained in anti-money laundering. And my course teacher always told me to think like a money launderer. So thinking like a money launderer in the case of, in the case of campaign donations, surely if I'm only going to get a penalty of $20,000 from the Electoral Commission for breaking electoral law, all I've got to do is find someone who will pay me $20,000 to break electoral law, and I've broken even. And
indeed.
In the case of spending on adverts, so this is maybe one for Sam, of course we've had a lot of lobbying on Facebook to improve their transparency for ad spending, but so many other companies collect personal information on users from their web browsing behavior, like Criteo or Experian, that surely I can just pay one of those companies for a whole bundle of behavioral information to target political ads at people.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more and then we can come back to the panel. All the people who have their hands raised are men. Women should ask questions as well.
Mr. Vergine. During in the years of lead and in the 70s in Italy, both left and right parties received finance from the United States and the Soviet Union through explicit undercover operations. But they were in opposition one to each other. Has money laundering and influence of other states changed to only one side of the political spectrum now? For example, you talked about how Lega receives finance from Russia, but do other parties receive finance in opposition to Lega, or has it become only one side of the political spectrum?
And then one more question back there, yeah. I'll take this lady too, and then we'll come back to the panel after that.
Good afternoon. What can you tell us about the money flows that will affect the upcoming European elections?
Question. Lady at the front here, and then we'll come back to the panel.
Hi, my question's to, can you hear me? My question's to Sam Jeffers. Thanks, I'm a great fan of the plugin that you developed. Very similar to the, well, in some ways similar to what ProPublica and Mozilla, in a way, targeting the actually revealing the micro-targeting that's going on. Facebook has blocked some of these plugins, and I think part of your plugin has been reinstated, but not to its full function. What is it, my question is, what is it that Facebook has done to take the place of that transparency that's been diminished by the blocking of your plugins, and what are we missing out on that we had access to before those plugins were blocked? Thank you.
I'll come to you after. Everyone can answer whichever of those questions you'd like to, and then we'll have a few more. So Sam, do you want to go first?
Okay, cool. So start with Paul's question. So on the electoral law, obviously, like, the fines are trivial in the context of, winning an election. Clearly, if and I think people would argue that the law is broken routinely in British elections, generally speaking, partly because the reporting requirements are quite onerous and people tend to get them wrong. But, the fines aren't a deterrent on doing things wrong, and so clearly there's an opportunity in electoral law to do it better and try and create more transparent and proper campaigning that way. In terms of targeting with data, yeah, you can use any data source you want to try and reach people and profile people in any number of ways that you want. The risks of doing that now under GDPR are much greater than they were previously if you do that incorrectly. And you still need a vector to go and reach people. And so the massive advantage of something like Facebook is, versus direct mail or anything else, is just massively cheaper. You can go back to the same people over and over again. You can optimize for engagement. You can test for better stuff. So, it's just a dramatically more efficient way of doing it. And, and Facebook does provide most of those tools kind of within their own platform for you anyway. So, I think that is, still continues to be a challenge. In terms of the question about what our plugin can and can't do, so we were collecting two things. So one was the ads themselves, and then the second was that if you click on the top right-hand corner of a Facebook ad and select the "Why am I seeing this?" option, Facebook gives you a small piece of text that says you're seeing this ad because you are, over 25 and live in this city or something, sort of quite generic and not very accurate description of the targeting. That was the thing that we were capturing before, and they built some blocks basically to try and stop that being automatically collected. They haven't replaced it with anything equivalent, so they don't publish that information routinely with their ads now. They publish some information about the demographics of the people who saw particular ads and some spending ranges. So there are things that we weren't getting before that Facebook does now publish, but targeting is still a big missing piece of it. And there have been some very interesting stories recently about discrimination through targeting. For example, there are obviously real issues with targeting in general when you talk about democracy is a national conversation, and if I'm showing one message to one group of people and another message to another group of people, but I'm not exposing why I'm doing that, it makes it very hard for people to get a full reading on a political advert. And so the opportunity is still there for them to kind of take that transparency quite a lot further than they have already, and we hope they do that.
Thank you. Alice?
Just to follow up on Sam's last point there, it seems to me that there's a really simple step that the Electoral Commission could take, which is, or that the electoral authorities could take, which is compelling political campaigns to publish a repository of all of their adverts, whether they're no matter who they're targeted at, just simply so that you could go to one place and say, oh, here are all of UKIP's adverts in one place. Here are all of Britain First adverts, or the Conservative Party or Labour Party's adverts in one place. And it baffles me as to why that hasn't been introduced and why there's no compulsion to do that.
Thank you. Stefano?
I'm going to pick up the question about Italy and the comparison between now and the 70s. I think there's no difference in the sense that we have data showing that also people from the US are funding members of the Italian parliament and political parties. For example, we wrote on L'Espresso about some big American entrepreneurs financing Più Europa, which is a political party pro-European Union. There's also been on the news the fact that Soros has been financing Più Europa still. The difference between the story I was mentioning about Lega and these facts that I just mentioned is that fundings coming from Soros and the other American entrepreneur were declared to the parliament, and the political parties were declaring that they received this money. Whereas this kind of operation that was, it was planned through Rosneft, Eni, and the European Bank acting as a filter, was not going to be declared because it was not a way of funding a party openly through documents. So that makes a difference, because for us, for every citizen, it should be a right to know where the money are coming from.
Thank you. And Peter, which of those did you want to pick up?
I'd try the last one, the hardest one. Where does the money? Who's going to spend money in the run-up to the European elections? I think what's really difficult, and one of the things that I really featured in the work we've been doing for the last while is, a lot of the time when you find out something's going on that's a bit strange, you find out after the fact. One of the reasons I think these Facebook ads that Sam's been talking about, that we covered as well, about there's a lot of money that's been spending on Facebook, is that you can see that in real time. People are actually going, oh my God, who's funding these Facebook ads I'm seeing? But a lot, in general, money, when you find out someone's been funding a political campaign, you find out later. You find out when returns are made to a electoral regulator, or something comes out. But one thing, the story that Mary referred to, we did last week about the US Christian right, what was interesting is that, as you can see, there's definitely a big upward trajectory in terms of the amount of American money that's going into European politics in the last few years, and that was all based on 990 filings, which are kind of filings that are made in the States by charities. But they only got, their most recent 990s are kind of 2017, so we don't know how much more money has been going in since 2017. I'd say there's a fair expectation there's been more in that sphere too.
And there are loopholes. So
yeah, there's loads of loopholes as well.
If in the United States, if you call yourself a church, you don't even have to declare anything. You don't have to file the same thing. And actually, a large number of these organisations are.
And you don't, and also, and again, at the back of it, even though you've got a name of an organisation that's giving money, oftentimes you don't know who's actually giving that money, that organisation, the money that they're giving out. So, for example, someone like the Alliance for Defending Freedom, which is a very influential conservative group in the States, they spend a lot of money in Europe, so they declare where their money goes in Europe, but they don't declare who gives them the money in the first place in America. So you don't know. At the heart of it, a lot of the time, is money that's secretive. So I'd expect we will see more of that in Europe in the coming months. And one of the most interesting things I think to look out for is a kind of transnationalism of nationalist movements across Europe. You've got a lot of nationalist movements across Europe, from the Lega to parties in Poland, parties in Ireland, who are nominally kind of very, very nationalistly minded and kind of internally focused. But we are seeing more and more coordination across those groups. The World Congress of Families in Verona recently, where a lot of representatives from these political parties were at. And the narratives, I think, is really interesting. And that's where I think Facebook and social media is interesting as well, is that how narratives can get spread across national boundaries. And it is very, very difficult in real time to track that. And that is the challenge, like with the Brexit referendum, where you can turn around 2 years later and go, oh, this money was spent in this really strange way. But the difficulty is, the political outworking has already happened.
And there are, as well, watch this space for proxy campaign groups. So, political parties can't spend money in certain ways and can't target voters in certain ways, or have spending limits, or have campaign finance restrictions. But they then ally themselves with other grassroots campaign organisations that aren't subject to the same restrictions.
Yeah, I think that's the wider thing. What we're seeing now is, are a lot of electoral rules kind of see politics as a thing that happens at election time only, and something that happens for a particular period of months which you regulate. But actually what we're seeing more, and that does take place through political parties, but more and more I think social movements, whether they're real or astroturf, play into politics, and politics actually lasts for, it kind of feels like we're in eternal, and kind of always in politics now. So cutting off political timelines like we do in the UK, laws, and I think probably a lot of other countries do that too, where this is a campaign moment, doesn't really actually fit with the reality of how politics is done anymore.
This one lady had a question, and then we're going to have to wrap up, I'm afraid. So go ahead quickly. No.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
My question kind of leads on from what you've just been saying. A lot of people involved in civic tech, stroke tech for good spaces, tech for social good in the UK and Ireland that I'm in contact with, often approach issues with like, here's the solution, where's the problem? Whereas now I think you have in front of us, here's the problem, let's find a solution together. How do you think people involved in those movements, if they aren't already, can get involved in supporting the projects that are going on here, because they seem perfect for that community?
So the first thing I would say, because it's my job to, is you should always support independent media. Someone is paying for what you read. If you don't have a subscription or you don't have a membership or you're not contributing financially to whatever you're reading online, if it's journalism, someone else is paying for it. So if you think that journalism shouldn't be that way, make a donation to whichever outlets you trust and you read. I'm not advocating one, but Open Democracy is very good. But it's really important that we as citizens understand that there are agendas behind how things are reported, and make moves ourselves, make commitments ourselves to changing the model there. But I'll ask other panelists to answer that question more broadly about civic tech, maybe Sam as well as everyone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we've always been, so for example, quite a citizen-led project. When we worked in Ireland, you know, a group of 4 or 5 citizens contacted us and said, there's this referendum happening, we want to know, you know, is foreign money going to be pouring into our campaign here? You know, we have no transparency, what are we going to do? And those, you know, 4 or 5 people are probably the most successful small group of people we've worked with anywhere, because, you know, within days, Facebook and Google were falling over themselves to kind of pre-announce transparency measures and ban foreign advertising and all sorts of things that they now almost do routinely around the rest of the world. And I think, you know, people can be very proud of the impact they can have through some of these projects. I mean, for us, like, you know, one of the projects we're doing is kind of related to what Pete was talking about, is we're trying to crowdsource a list of keywords that will be used in the European election campaign. So, you know, what are the topics across all of Europe that people want to know something about? And if those topics then pop up in advertising or elsewhere online, you can start to kind of relate things together. And I think one of the challenges is that there's a lack of kind of routine and a kind of openness to the way that people are investigating and researching some of this stuff. And I think, you know, in a way, like by working together, we can kind of build some of those tools and do interesting things. So again, like that's another thing we're trying to do to kind of keep an eye on what's happening over the next few months.
Thank you, everyone. I think we'll stop there because people are rushing off to go to other things. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to the panelists. Yes, thank you.